Merci beaucoup pour l'introduction. So I will switch to English so that non-French speaker can understand. So it's a great pleasure to be here. So I will present a series of work that started quite some time ago with my good old friend Olivier Bénichou from Sorbonne University as well. And I want to acknowledge the quite important contribution of Thomas Guérin in what I will be presenting. And Thomas happens to be a former student of Jean-François, and he joined us for a postdoc later on. And now he's been fully independent for 4 years. So that's for the theory part. I'm a theorist, but I will also show you quite some experimental data, and for most of them, they will come from single particle tracking in live cells, and that was a collaboration we had at the time with Maxime Dahan and his colleagues Xavier Darjac and others. And if time permits, I will also mention new experimental data that are in purely artificial system, and those come from Amit Kelly in Bordeaux. So let me start by restating the problem that, in fact, Jean-François has already introduced. So it's very simple. We'll be looking at what are called random search problems. And to define a random search problem, you need a searcher which will perform some kind of random walk, diffusive motion that I will make more precise in a minute. And this happens in the presence of a site of interest that we will call a target that will not move, and that will be my B here. And the question we want to ask is very simple. How long does it take for the searcher to find the target? And we argue that only the first visit will matter. You trigger something of interest upon the first visit. So what you need is the first passage time, which is a random variable, and we will be interested typically in the average of this quantity to get a simple number, and potentially it's a full distribution. So that's the technical problem that I want to discuss, and why doing that? Because many physical processes, and in particular biophysical processes, will be controlled by such type of first encounter events. And the example that I would like to keep in mind all along the talk is the one of diffusion-limited reactions, which is very simple. It just says that my searcher could be a molecule. And if this molecule needs to react with B upon first encounter, in the regime where the system is very dilute, then the limiting step will be the transport step and not the local reorganization of the chemical reaction itself. So formally, we're doing very simple textbook first-order kinetics with some A that needs to react with B to give something of interest. And usually, you write this down with a rate, okay? And the question is, in the case where it's limited by transport, can I still define a rate? Can I relate this rate to this mean first passage time? Is it as straightforward? In other words, do I have a very simple first-order kinetics, which would mean that the survival probability of A, so the probability that the reaction has not yet occurred, is a simple exponential with a single timescale in your problem. So that's not clear when you're dealing with this diffusion-limited regime, and that's what I want to discuss. So as I said, this type of diffusion-controlled reaction are very relevant at the cell scale, and an example that was, for me, very inspiring comes from this collaboration with Maxime Dahan, who developed single particle tracking techniques in live cells, which essentially means that you can image single proteins that would diffuse in live cells. So that's what he did, and typically you get tracks. So you see a single protein here, fluorescent in the nucleus. It's moving around. You can track, you can get trajectories, and you can make this quantitative. And at the time, Maxime was interested in actually measuring these trajectories, and these proteins, some of them are very special function in terms of regulating transcription, and the typical reaction scheme that we have in mind is that one of these guys will be a transcription factor, which means that it will trigger the expression of a gene when it binds to a specific sequence. And that you will do with a single specific sequence, which means that you're doing this type of very simple chemistry, but now with one single B. So you cannot really talk about concentration, and you will be very much controlled by the transport and by the fluctuation. So I will come back to this setup, but this setup was completely engineered, so thanks to progress in genetics and imaging. Here the target, you can design it, so you can modify genetically the cell so that you know where the target is. You can have a locus that will be the target where your protein will bind, and then you record tons of trajectory, and you can actually measure this search time and make all this quantitative. Why is it so important? Because again, these type of processes are extremely important for the cell to function properly. So you want this type of reaction to be very efficient in the cell. So that's the first example. Just to mention, I've been working, and in fact recently I'm sort of working more on larger scales, looking at cell migration itself. But again, in some cases, you can still look at search processes. And why that's so? If you look at a cell moving in a tissue, so here it's a neutrophil, a white blood cell, its function is to find targets. In that case, that would be to find pathogens. And if you want to quantify their efficiency in performing their task, finding this typically bacteria that would enter the organism, you're still dealing with some kind of random motion here, and you want to assess the efficiency of space exploration in finding targets. So formally, the problem is very much this one. You have your cell, you have the target, and you want to be able to tell quantitatively how long will it take to find the target for the cell. So I'm more at this level now, but I will not discuss that. That was just to mention this type of application. And the last one, in fact, we did not pursue it too much, but I kind of like it. You can even change scale at an even larger scale. Here you have a dish that is completely macroscopic, and you have ants. So this comes from Ophir Feinerman, the Weizmann Institute, and these ants are completely starved. And they go out of the nest, and somewhere, I don't even remember where it is, but you have a droplet of food. And these guys, they are starving, which means that their function is to find food. They're desperately looking for food. And if you look at the trajectory, again, they are some kind of random trajectory. And if you want to be able to tell how good they are at doing what they do, you need to be able to estimate the first passage for this type of trajectory to the target. So formally, it's very much the same question. You still have an a target of interest, and you want to get information about the time you need to find this target. Formally, it will be the same, but I will stick to this example at the cellular scale, so typically diffusion and typically transcription kinetics with one protein of interest that must find a target site on DNA. So technically what it means that I will deal with a confining volume, so typically the nucleus, so volume V. I will assume that I might have some information of where I start, so a typical distance from my starting position and the target itself, and I want to be able to estimate the first passage time, at least it means, to the target. So that's my technical question, and in particular I want to discuss how it depends on the confining volume itself, the geometry via the distance from the source to target, and mostly the transport process itself, which was sort of under the carpet so far, because we are dealing with molecules, typically protein in the nucleus, which is highly crowded. And when you're dealing with such level of crowding, arguably, the process will not be as simple as Brownian diffusion. You expect active or passive contribution, I'll come back to that, normal or anomalous diffusion, and again, I'll come back to that. And mainly, I want to focus on the Markov versus non-Markov aspects that might kick in. And again, I will define all these questions. Altogether, when you get an estimate of this time, because it's biology, you want these processes to be efficient, so you might look for optimization problem. Can I make it more efficient? Can I make this fast? So before going there, I need to sort of schematically discuss what we can expect when we are dealing with a particle of interest. So again, that would be my protein that is diffusing in a crowded, complex environment. What does it mean? It means that you will interact with the environment. And very schematically, what you can try to do is to sort of decouple the time scale of interest for your particle, what you will measure, its own dynamics, with the time scale that would describe the evolution of the environment. And typically, very schematically, you have two rather simple cases where you can very cleanly separate time scales. The first one is what Jean-François discussed, Brownian motion. If these blue guys are just water, they move much faster than any time scale of interest. You will end up with diffusion, which is characterized by a linear mean square displacement in time. That's the law of diffusion. Your process is Markov, so no memory effect. I'll make it more precise in a minute. And you have all the tools that have been presented. So you could write master equation, you could write Fokker-Planck equation, you have renewal, so everything is fine. In fact, it's not so obvious, but you have another limit which is quite okay, is the opposite limit where the environment is very slow, completely frozen. So then in that case, you can assume that it's given. You have a disordered medium. So here that would be my blue rods. And I assume that they don't move so much at the time scale of interest for my red particle. In that case, in fact, the dynamics can still be Markovian, which means memoryless. In essence, it means that if you tell me where the particle is, statistically, I will be able to tell you where it will be. I can describe its evolution no matter what happened before. The fact that I have all these crowding and roadblocks will not impair on the time correlation. That's not the problem. But however, what will happen is that the space itself will be very much restricted, and that can also change the game. And typically what happens routinely, and I'd like to introduce this very simple model, which is useful to keep in mind. If the environment is static, at some point, if you add and add and add roadblocks, you will reach a threshold concentration of these roadblocks where you will have percolation, which means that if you have too many of them, you will be completely cornered and you will not be able anymore to fully cross your system. And when you're close to this threshold, what is known is that, in fact, the available space is a fractal. And what means a fractal? It means that if now you draw a sphere in your system of radius r, you count the volume that is accessible, you will change the scaling. So if I would start in the plane, the number of sites in a normal lattice would scale like r squared. But if I have too many roadblocks close to the percolation threshold, I will get a scaling that is non-trivial with a non-integer value here that is smaller than 2. So I will change completely the scaling. And when you're close to this point, percolation, what you find is that if you let a random walker go in this type of structures, you will get something which is a non-linear scaling of the mean square displacement. So you will naturally get anomalous diffusion. And qualitatively, you can understand when you're in this regime, you have many dead ends, and all these dead ends will induce negative correlations. And you have so many of them that you destroy your linear scaling. So you're still Markov, but you end up with an anomalous scaling of diffusion. And usually we introduce the walk dimension, which characterizes this nonlinear scaling. It amounts to describing the trajectory as a polymer, and you ask how many steps do you make in a typical sphere of radius r. For diffusion, you know that this would be 2, and if it's anomalous and typically subdiffusive, you will be going backward and backward over and over, so typically it will be larger than 2. So that will define the walk dimension that I will use and the fractal dimension when we're in this regime. Okay, so these are the two intermediate scales regimes that we can deal with, and of course, as you can expect, the interesting case and the generic rule will be when you're dealing with a dense, crowded environment, there is no reason why the environment would not have a timescale that is comparable with the one you're dealing with. And when you're in this regime, so typically if you take dense colloids, if you take very long monomers, if you take a particle that is bound to a membrane, you will end up with a description where you cannot make this separation of timescale. And in that case, you will be non-Markovian, which means that you will have memory effect. What does it mean? It means that now if you give me the position of my particle of interest, if I want its future description, I will need to have information in the past. And depending on the past trajectory that is green, red, or blue here, the future will be impacted. So that's what I call memory or non-Markovian dynamics. So what I want to argue is that this will be the rule as long as you get to dense, crowded media. And again, going back to my other systems, you could argue that a cell itself is a bunch of degrees of freedom. There is no reason why there would not be such timescale emerging there, which means that typically for a cell you expect non-Markovian models. And of course, if you take ants or larger organisms, that would be the case. So for nomenclature, again, Markov, non-Markov is different from anomalous normal. This is just the scaling of the mean square displacement, and that will also be different from active versus passive. So be careful with all these definitions. Okay, so now putting that back in the context of the cell, which is this one, what can we say? Well, this is complicated, obviously, whereas you look at the cell cytoplasm, so that would be an artist's view of what happens in a bacteria. I try to put numbers, but typically what people expect is that just the volume fraction, which is occupied by protein and ribosome, it's up to 40%. It means that it's super dense. So if now you assume that you have a particle diffusing in there, neglecting interaction with the rest seems to be very unlikely. So we don't really know a priori. That's a really hard problem. We don't really know what will happen. Do you get to normal versus anomalous? Do you have active versus passive effect? Are you Markov or non-Markov? This is not clear, and it will very much depend on what you're tracking. If you take an ion, obviously, a very small particle will diffuse as a Brownian particle, you do not care, but as long as you will be tracking proteins, you're very likely to have interactions. In the nucleus, same game, except that structurally this is very different because now you're packing 1 meter long DNA in a small confined volume. The local environment and the nature of coding will be very different. So again, you expect all these type of effects, but they're very likely to be particle dependent. So that's what I want to discuss. So let's get into it. And before getting to memory effect, I will just restate what we've been doing first under the assumption of Markovian dynamics, which means that I will use the fact that I can neglect memory effect. I'm not saying that it's relevant, but that's at the time that was the only type of theory that we had in mind, that we had accessible. Let me just, in this context, give you a bit of background and two very simple results that date back to ages ago, in fact, but are quite nice. First one is, in fact, what concerns mean return times. If for some reason you know that you start from the target over and over, you want the time needed to come back, you have a very old result, which is extremely general because it's in fact trivial, but people tend to not to really know it. It's an ergodic property. If you know that you're in a stationary set and that you come back over and over, the mean time you need to come back must be just 1 over the probability of being there. Okay? This is completely general. This is true for non-Markov, and that gets you exactly the result that you want. So that's a first result that I find very useful. Another one that was derived mostly for regular lattices, so it's just going to discrete spaces, but it amounts to essentially the same. So typically for normal diffusion, a version of the problem where you average over all starting position, you have very old result from Montrol that gets you explicitly the scaling of the mean first passage time to the target, average over all possible initial conditions, so that you lose the information of where the target is. And the main result here is that, in fact, you have two regimes, even for normal diffusion, and that will lead me to introduce on the notion of compact versus non-compact that Jean-François already introduced. What could be surprising is that you have two different regimes in this case. So the scaling of this time will be linear in the volume. So n is the number of accessible sites. So that's the volume if you would think in a continuous space. And in the case where the walk is non-compact, which means typically Brownian motion in 3 dimensions, so qualitatively, what does it mean? It means that you sparsely explore space. If you take one site in your system, you're not even sure that you will ever reach it. So typically, you will leave many sites unvisited. And if you do that, what you find is that the scaling of the search time will be linear in the volume. Now, if you change the regime and if you compact will mean that the dimension of the walk, which is defined by the scaling of the mean square displacement, is no larger than the fractal dimension. That would be typically Brownian motion in 1D, but that will be typically the case on fractals. What you find in that case is that now you have a super diffusive scaling with n, which means that you're much worse than the non-compact case. So that's the first important distinction, and in terms of optimality, that's already quite instructive because it tells you that what you should do is try to be non-compact. Because if you're non-compact, you will not oversample space. If you have no information of where the target is, that's the best you can do. And even better than that, if now you think as this same problem, imagine that you're super smart. You can design whatever strategy you want. The best strategy is in fact so-called lawnmower strategy, la tondeuse à gazon, which means that you systematically explore space. Imagine that you can tell where you are, you can remember everything you did. If you do that, and if you have strictly no information of where the target is, you will still be linear in n. So a dead stupid particle, if it's non-compact, scaling-wise, it will do as good as any super smart searcher. And that will be always true, so that's qualitatively important to keep in mind. So building up on that, what we did at the time with Olivier is to try to generate these results to this very problem where we have, so typically our problem in a nucleus of, let's say a nucleus of confining volume V, we start from S with a given distance R and we want to find a target. So typically it's not a trivial problem because we have 3 length scale in the problem, so you have the size of the target itself, you have this distance source to target, and you have the typical size of your system. So there is no obvious solution to the problem. And first what we did was to assume that we could neglect any correlation and use Markov property, and that will be very convenient, and I will just briefly mention the steps that we did. But beyond the fact that we're Markov, we just assume that we have a scale invariant process, which means that it is fully defined by the space dimension, so this fractal dimension, but that could be integer, and the walk dimension that only characterizes the scaling of the mean square displacement. So that could be anomalous, but that is fully determined by the walk dimension that determines this power here. So these are the only hypotheses we made, and the idea was to go beyond Brownian motion, for which you have differential equation and you can solve explicitly, as Jean-François did earlier on. Here in that case, when you're dealing with fractals, you might not get any differential equation to write down. But still what you have, because you're Markov, is what is called the renewal property, which very much builds on the Markov property, and which is very simple. That's why I take 1 minute to tell you what it is, and it's really simple. The idea is to relate what you want. What you want is the first passage distribution, which is this guy F, and you want to relate it to what you know, which is the propagator, which is just the probability of being there, no matter how many times you've been there. Okay? So what you write is very simple. You write that the probability of being at the target is just a partition over all events of first passage occurrence to the target and then going back. So you make this convolution and it just reads like that. You just say that you partition over the first encounter and that relates F to P. In essence, that's it. Okay? And that uses very much the Markov property, because after the first passage, you can completely forget of what happened before. You're just describing your trajectory. And building up on this equality, you can sort of tweak it and get asymptotics, and you end up with an explicit determination of the mean, first passage time, which is completely explicit in terms of the volume, so it will be always linear in the volume. But now what is striking is the dependence on the distance, R, from the target, with two very qualitative different regimes. So if you're non-compact, so again, typically diffusion in 3D, what you find is that your mean time to find the target will be, as Jean-François said, in 3D, almost completely independent of where you start. You don't care, because here you have a negative power law. You reach a plateau very fast, and you could start anywhere. You will find the same time scale. Now, if you compact, so typically if you live on a percolation cluster in a very crowded medium that leads to percolation, in that case, here you're compact, and now the scaling with the distance is a positive power, which means that typically you will have a very striking dependence on where you start. So that changes completely the type of kinetics that you have. So not just getting back to the original example, again, I take a transcription factor in a nucleus. What does it mean? You have two options. Either crowding effects are negligible for some reason, you end up with Brownian diffusion, then you can check that our formula works well. So you have typically this plateau very soon, which means that essentially you could start anywhere, you could look for a target gene that is anywhere in the nucleus, you don't care, you will find exactly the same. And in fact, what you can show, you can work out the full distribution. You have first order kinetics, which means that there is a single time scale in your problem, which is this mean, which is controlled by the volume. Now, if crowding effects are strong enough, and if you switch to compact, so typically, if you picture, it's a super simplification, but if there is some underlying percolation cluster-like structure, then in that case, what it means that now the mean time will be very much dependent on the source to target distance. If you start close, you can be super fast, but if you start far, you will be super slow. So it is now controlled by the geometry. And in fact, looking at the distribution, what you find is that you completely lose this first order kinetics. You're not anymore a single exponential. Now you have many time scales in your problem, and you can get a mixture of starting close, which gets you this first time scale that is controlled by the distance, which can be very short, and you have the very long time scale, which is the one that would be average over the initial condition, where you lose any information and when you're very bad because you oversample in the compact case. So we argue that this would very much change the type of kinetics that you can get, which means that we really want to know if we are here or there. Are we compact or non-compact when we are dealing with diffusion in the nucleus? So to answer that question, remember, this discussion boils down to determining what is the largest, the dimension of the trajectory, the walk dimension, or the dimension of space. That's what you want to compare. So you want to have access to both. And at the time, that's what Maxime was aiming at. So they had, because I didn't do much, they had data, for example, of you can look for direct texture analysis of what is the nuclear space. And an indirect way that they had at the time was to look at the distribution of RNA polymerase in the nucleus. You just have an intensity map of where they stand at steady state, and what you find, if you draw spheres, you count how much you have, what is the amount in a growing sphere of radius r, what you find is you get a fractal scaling which is not 3. It does not scale like R3, so it argues that you might have some underlying fractal structure which is of intermediate dimensions. You have many other techniques to do that, and in particular you have the chromosome capture method that got very popular since these early works, and they also find some underlying fractal scaling that essentially comes from the fact that you're dealing with a polymer. So for polymer physicists, you have many models of packing that will lead to this fractal scaling, so the fact that there is an underlying fractal does not come so much as a surprise. The question is it very much the space that is explored by your molecule of interest? And that's not clear. So that's sort of where it stands, but we have indications that there might be a fractal structure.
Can I ask
Sure.
If you assume that it's due to power statistics for DNA, it's 2 the fractal dimension, no?
Wait, do you know you have all this, the crumpled globule model that gives you 3?
In this case,
yeah, so you can have intermediate depending on the type of model you... And these people, they argued that the loop statistic can be intermediate, and from this IC data, they have power laws that could be in between. So it's not completely clear. So now let's look at the walk dimension. The walk dimension, remember, it is only given by the scaling of the mean square displacement. So you just need to track. So let's track. I already show you that from Maxime. You can track protein. Okay, now let's see what you find. So the first set of experiments, they just put fluorophore. So that's just a fluorophore in the nucleus, in live cells. This guy is not supposed to interact with anyone. That's just a fluorophore. You do the tracking. You plot the mean square displacement. You have limitation, it's hard, you have a focal plane, it's really hard to get very long trajectory, but what you find is something which is consistent with linear scaling, let's say, which means that this one is close enough to what would be diffusion. And in fact, what came as a surprise, if you look at the numbers, the diffusion coefficient is not far from what you would expect in plain water. You have 1 meter long DNA, you put a protein, and still it's extremely fast. But this one does not bind to anyone. So it's probably small enough so that it can get into free space. But the result is that it's almost free. You can test much further the scaling, so looking at the propagator to test that it's very much a scaling function, and you get a decent collapse. So this to say that for this protein, the conclusion was it looks like simple Brownian diffusion as if it were in water for this protein in the nucleus. Now let's switch to one that actually does something. So again, I'm definitely not an expert, but this positive transcription elongation factor B, this is something that actually does something for transcription. So it binds to a bunch of proteins that bind to DNA. So this one is a sticker, if you want. Looking at this one, you can again track. You measure the mean square displacement, and in that case, you find something which is clearly slower and clearly subdiffusive. You can try to rescale and check that you have a decent collapse. So you find something which is consistent with the fractal scaling, where the walk dimension, so the dimension of trajectory would be 4, which means that no matter what is the accessible space, this guy would be compact because this is larger than 3 anyway. So this one is in fact consistent with a compact exploration. So that suggests that in fact all this is regulated by the affinity these proteins have for DNA. Okay? And the question at the time was, can this be tuned? Is it something interesting? Can we sort of tune the affinity to make the process efficient or not, depending on the conditions? And in fact, that was some kind of old idea that was in the air that Maxime wanted to pursue experimentally. And so the idea was not to track over time, and I already show you this set of data where you have individual tracks, you have a target somewhere, you're just tracking so far. And here they injected a TET repressor, which is a construct that was designed at the time, and they had an idea that it might have this interesting behavior. So when you do the tracking in that case, what you find is that in fact, plotting the mean square displacement, you find that it has a very broad distribution of slopes. So some are super fast and they behave linearly, and some, this blue regime, you see that they almost do not move. So you have a broad distribution of typical behavior, and when you plot the distribution of this diffusion coefficient. Ideally, we would have loved to see 2, but we got 3. So you get one population which is very slow and 2 that are faster, in essence. But the good thing is that the one that is slow, you can kill it when you add a drug that is known to block interaction with DNA. So the picture is, what you see here is in fact the fact that you have 2 states, one that interacts with DNA and another one which is free and essentially diffuses freely. For some reason, you have two peaks for the fast diffusing one, but you clearly lose the slow one when you prevent the binding to DNA. What is interesting here is that it's not only 2 populations, if now you track over time a single particle, what you find over time, you can locally in time measure the effective diffusion coefficient. You find that in fact they switch over time, which means that a single of this protein can be fast, then slow, then fast, then slow, then fast, then slow, etc., etc. So from this type of data, the picture was that in fact it binds and unbinds all the time. You can even get the statistics of the fast and slow excursion events, which in fact suggests from this data that this protein is both. When it binds, it is compact, but when it's free, it is as non-compact. So the picture was that maybe this is in fact helpful. And this idea of combining slow diffusion on DNA and fast diffusion away from DNA, it echoes very much the intermittent strategy picture that Jean-François discussed. And in fact, historically, so I will tell you, yes, I have time, briefly this short story, because it's quite nice and it dates back to the 70s. And at the time, people were doing, so not single particle tracking, but you could still measure reaction rates. And they were looking at the binding of the LAC repressor, so you have in vitro and in vivo data, with their specific target sequence on DNA. They could do that, and I don't remember so well the original paper, but the main claim was that what they observed was too fast. If you assume only 3-dimensional diffusion, the timescale that Jean-François derived is this one. So the typical timescale that you get is the volume that you need to explore, the diffusion coefficient, and the size. If you plug that in, given the experiments they had, it was typically 100 times too long as compared to the observation. And what is quite nice is that at the time, these people in the 70s, they had no idea whatsoever of single particle tracking. They came up with this idea that, well, we know that DNA is locally negatively charged. We know that these proteins, they have some positively charged sites. They might bind non-specifically, slide, which means that they diffuse in 1D along the DNA strands and then go off and then go on, etc., etc. They had this idea, and at the time, they even made quite nice calculation, in particular Berg, and showed that this might be advantageous and that can lead to fast binding rate. So this series of papers are quite impressive for random walk people, to be honest. Later on, for some reason, we got interested in this topic with Olivier and Leonid Mirny as well at the same time, and we cooked a very simple model building up on these intermittent strategies, and you can show formally with very simple hypothesis that in fact if you compute with this type of strategy the mean search time, you can optimize. It's not only efficient, but you get a minimum that you can reach if you tune to 1, which is the time you spend on DNA. So you can tune the affinity so that this time is actually minimized. So you could, in principle, optimize the search by having these two-state dynamics. Still, it was only theoretical, based on this idea that was 30 years old, and the question was, does it actually exist? And I really want to show you experiments, because these were really crazy experiments. At the time, it was Pierre Desbiol and Isabelle Bonnet, who's still around, and they wanted to see it in vitro. And so they had DNA that was sort of extended by a flow. You bind it to a glass plate, so you need to tune the tension, so it's already non-trivial. And then you have this enzyme, because it's the one that you believe would do the job. It is fluorescent. You image this guy, and you're waiting for events where a single one would bind to your DNA, so which means that you should be very dilute not to get 2 and get a single one. You do that, and you show first that, in fact, along X, you diffuse, you have a linear scaling. So it means that you do get events where it binds, and it actually does diffuse in 1D. The worst was the other one, showing that it can go off and on. And for that, you need events when you're super dilute, and they spend like months. And sometimes you see this, boom, it's there, and boom, it's there. And they had 100 of events. And when you work out the statistics, you can show that these translocation events, their cumulative distribution, fits what would happen if it would go off diffuse 3D and rebind. So you can compute the distribution, and what they found was that it is consistent, which suggests that, in fact, some of them actually bind, diffuse, go off, diffuse in 3D, and bind again. So that was a proof, experimental proof, completely in vitro that this exists. So now coming back to what I just showed you in the nucleus, this data that I summarize here, the picture we had with Maxime was that, in fact, what was measured there was the equivalent of this very simple picture, but now in eukaryotes. We have one of these peaks that we attributed to binding events, where the diffusion is much slower, but it's still there, and then it goes off, diffuses in 3D, and rebinds. And so we sort of extended the model, which is very simple and has quite a bunch of simplifying assumptions, where we just assume that the chromatin was some kind of fractal with no predefined structure, but a fractal dimension df, and the walk dimension of the protein living on this fractal as given. And then it could go off, diffuse in 3D, rebind, diffuse on the fractal for auto 1, etc., etc. So that very much generalizes what was done before in 1D. And you can again work out a mean search time, and again what you find is that you get a minimum, and this minimum is realized when typically the time tau 1 bound is of the same order as the time tau 3 that is unbound. So this generalizes to what would happen in a nucleus, assuming a fractal configuration of space. In short, how do we understand the fact that you optimize? You should remember qualitatively what means not compact and compact. This type of strategy, at long distances, you take advantage of being non-compact when you go 3D, which means that you do not oversample. So that's very good because it gets you a scaling that will be linear in what you have to search for, and that's the best you could ever do. So it's good to have a non-compact scaling. However, what you gain is the fact that at short time scales, I told you when you're compact, at short distances, you're very efficient, you do not miss. So very locally, you can get extra timescales that are short, and that makes the search very efficient locally. So when you do that, you combine both, and that optimizes overall the time you need to search. So this idea is in fact very general, and the model that Jean-François showed is in spirit the same. You combine diffusion, which is more compact than the ballistic motion of active processes, and by playing with both, you can sort of take advantage of these two type of regimes. So that's an optimization which is very general. Okay, so that was kind of a longish historical description of what we have done with Markov. Description, again, everything that I derived, this scaling that I derived was based on the Markov assumption. As I argued, there is no reason whatsoever that a Markov description holds when you're tracking particles in very dense systems. There is no reason for that. So now I want to discuss what can we do theoretically if now we are given a process. So a process will be the tracking typically. So I'm given the trajectory of this guy, this red guy. No matter what's around, I know that it is in a complex environment, and I will assume that I'm given this process and it is fully described at its mean square displacement. So that will be given for me. That's what defines the process. And for technical reason, I will need to assume that it is Gaussian. It's not super restrictive, but that will be very useful. So it means that the mean square displacement will fully define the process. Now what I want to do is exactly the same problem. I want to estimate the search time for this class of process where I lost the information of being Markov, so I will not be able to use these properties that were key in the first derivation. So what will that change? The fact that now you will have memory effects and you want to take them into account. What is key is that for Gaussian processes, everything is encoded in this second moment in the variant. So this fully encodes the memory effect. And in fact, believe me, you can prove that if this second moment is not strictly linear, so strictly linear would mean exactly Brownian motion, as long as you're not strictly linear, it means that you're non-Markov. You have memory effect. Okay, so that's a theorem. Okay, so this guy moved. So let's get to it. So first, does it even exist? And yes, I want to argue that even, so I'm not arguing that we have evidence in cells. I'm sure we could We could find here I'll be dealing with artificial synthetic soft matter systems that are very classical, but actually fall right there in this class. So the simplest and maybe most striking one would be the case of colloids. And the worst case that you could get is to go to low dimension because you will build up very strong correlation. So it's typically if you take this setup that will be one-dimensional where your colloids cannot overtake, so it's called a single file. This process is known to be Gaussian at long times. And if you look at the mean square displacement, because of all the correlation with all the time scales coming from interaction with the other colloids, you end up with a very subdiffusive regime, so very long-lived correlation. So that's sort of the worst-case scenario, but experimentally, this is experimental. This exists very much. You could take another example of crowded medium, which is quite simple. You put a colloid in a liquid crystal, so made of polymer, and in the nematic phase, what you can show and what you can measure is that, in fact, because now you're coupled with the relaxation of the nematic order parameter, you have a non-trivial time scale that will induce memory effects. They are not so fancy. If you track, you see that you are diffusive, then you have a crossover regime to another diffusive scaling. That's okay, as long as you're not simply linear, you're not Brownian, you will have memory effect. Here it just tells you that you're coupled to the relaxation time scales that will come from the medium. It's nothing fancy, but it means that you do have memory effect in there. Another example comes from proteins. So typically any kind of polymer, if you're looking typically at one given domain, so you look at the distance between two domains, these two guys will be correlated via the full polymer. This will induce correlation that will be long-lived. You have a broad spectrum. And again, you can show experimentally that this is perfectly Gaussian. So what I'm talking about actually exists, and it is kind of systematic as long as you have either polymer-like systems, dense systems, colloidal or polymeric. So that's sort of the rule. I still give you a bit of technical steps because that's kind of important. So that was very much an idea by Thomas Guérin at the time. What can we do now that we have memory effect? We are not Markov. If you're not Markov, it means that you lose the renewal equation in principle. So what Thomas did was in fact to still write the same partition, if you remember. So I will still have P, which is the probability of being somewhere, and I will denote by F the probability to reach the point of interest for the first time. And you still want to relate F, which is what you want, to P, which describes just the probability of being somewhere, and that will be characterized by the mean square displacement because you're Gaussian. So this guy you know, this guy you don't, in short. You can still write some kind of renewal, but now there is a subtlety. So what you write is what is the probability of being at the target. You can always say that there must be an event where I first hit the target, and then after this event, I somehow made a loop and went back. You can still do that. That's perfectly true. Now that you have memory effect, the green part depends on the red part. So the green part is not anymore a simple propagator because now you need to look at trajectories knowing that you just hit for the first time the target. And because you have memory effect, this guy has nothing to do a priori with just the probability of being somewhere. So that's where the trick is. So what you need to know is the statistic for this process that is conditioned by the fact that you start right after a first passage event. It sounds complicated. I will just show you how it looks like. Very simple. I take this example just to generate trajectories. So the position of one of these colloids with a bunch of other colloids, single file, which means that I cannot take over. This has very strong memory effect. This is the position, and I will assume I start from 10. And my target, my point of interest is 0. Okay? I let it go. At some point, I will hit for the first time the target, and then it keeps going. I will have some green trajectory. What I'm interested in is starting from there, so I erase the blue part, and I take only the green part. That defines me a process. I do that over and over, another trajectory. I keep only the green part. That defines the process. Now you want the statistics of this process, which is conditioned by the fact that it starts right after a first passage event. And if you do that, this process is in fact non-trivial. Here I started, X is perfectly symmetric. Okay, you can go left or right, you have correlation, but there is no bias whatsoever. So if I would just measure a typical step, on average, this is 0. There is no reason to go left or right. But now, if you take my process that is conditioned by a first passage event, you know that you started from 10 and that you hit 0. And on average, here it's the numerical average of all these guys, the mean trajectory is not 0 anymore. No, on average, you will come back because your process has negative correlations. So on average, if you know that you started positive, after a first passage event, statistically, you will come back. And because your process is Gaussian, you need only to know mu if you want to fully characterize the process. So in short, all your correlation will be encoded in this trajectory conditioned by a first passage event. So that's what you want to know if you want to explicitly compute your first passage time. Technically, your Gaussian, you need 2 moments, and the variance, you can take it as identical as the original process, so it is given by construction. So the only unknown that remains is this trajectory after a first passage event. And that's what you want to know. If you're able to get this one, you will get everything you want. I'll show you the result, but don't look for the math if you don't want to. There is no problem. What you get is an explicit expression for the mean search time. It's still linear in the volume that you live in. And now it's expressed only in terms of this mu, which is the average of the trajectory right after the first passage. And psi is given, that's what defines your process, that's the mean square displacement. And mu, you can work out an integral equation for mu. It's a closed equation, it's hard, it's ugly, but it fully defines mu. So worst case scenario, you solve it numerically, you get mu, you plug it back in, and you have exactly what you want. Okay? What it means in essence is that, again, this future trajectory, it's represented here. So what you must find, and what we find here, is that because you have memory effect, what will happen after hitting the target here will be, in fact, controlling all the information you need to know in terms of correlation in your process that will be fully quantified by this quantity. It is determined there, and it allows you for an explicit determination of your mean first passage time. An important feature, and then I will give you an example, you'll see that will be more comfortable. What if it would be Markov? What do we lose if Markov? I told you all the processes that I take, they have no external bias, they are symmetric. So if I would assume my process to have no memory, in the future of the first passage event, I don't know that there has been a first passage event because I lose any memory of whatsoever. So the Markov hypothesis will be that mu is strictly 0 at all times. That will be the Markov approximation. And when you look at it, you find that Markov completely, systematically overestimates the mean first passage time. And I'll come back to this. So now let me show you that it works first. So on this and I just show you results from this procedure. So I take what is called fractional Brownian motion. It's just a generalization of what you would get for single phi diffusion or simple polymer model. They are Gaussian, and you can define a walk dimension. Here it's called Hertz usually, but that fits in this power law scaling of the mean square displacement. So you can work it out. You compute from the equation that I showed you the mean trajectory in the past. Again, you start positive, you hit the target, and on average, because you have correlation, you will snap back. You have negative correlation, so you will on average go back. That you can make quantitative, and thanks to this characterization of the future, you have an exact determination of your mean first passage time that works quantitatively very well. So you have numerics and the theory here in blue. And now if you compare to the Markovian theory, in this case, it's completely off. In fact, you can show that in the case where you're pretty hardly subdiffusive, the Markovian theory overestimates very much and quantitatively the predictions that you would make. In fact, it even diverges in this limit where Hertz would be 1/4. It's not even defined, so you would find something virtually infinite. So that means that it's quantitative and it works very well. A last example that I just show it to you just to show you that even if the system looks kind of boring, so again I come back to this colloid in a liquid crystal, I have a single time scale here. So I have memory effect, but I just have a crossover between two diffusion. Boring, okay? At long time scale, it will be perfectly Brownian. I just have an extra time scale that tells me that I will cross over between two regimes. In this case, you can still work it out. And you still have memory effects that are important even if they are characterized by a single time scale. So you play the same game, and again, if you compare, so all this would be theory and numerics, if you compare to the Markov approximation, you can be off to a good extent, even for this model where you have a single time scale in your memory kernel. So that shows you quantitatively that these memory effects are important, and that gives you a procedure to get them quantitatively. I know that this future trajectory is a bit abstract. I want to show you what happens. And to show you what happens, it's useful to take the example of a polymer. So my particle is a monomer, and it's typically a Rouse polymer, a chain of beads and springs. Okay, so my full problem is this bead, which is my bead of interest. It is coupled to a bunch of others, and I want the mean first passage time to t. So it is very well known that if I do not know the position of all the beads, the tagged monomer dynamics is Markov because it is correlated to the other degrees of freedom. But now if you take into account the dynamics of all monomers, you can work out the dynamics of the full polymer. That you can do. And that Thomas did at the time. And what you find is that, in fact, to determine now the search time, what you need to know is the conformation of the polymer when you hit the target. And what happens is that, in fact, when you hit the target, so here my monomer hits the target, this brown particle here, when you hit the target, what you find is that statistically, the polymer is not at all equilibrated. It is much more extended than it would be at equilibrium. And all, so far at the time, Markovian approximation assumed effectively that, in fact, the polymer was equilibrated, which means that it would be like this cloud around the monomer of interest, so no stretch whatsoever. So everybody was assuming this type of equilibrium conformation at the instant of reaction, whereas what we show is that, in fact, it is much more extended. But now you understand what happens. And the connection that we have with this story of mean future trajectory, because what it says is that when I react, in fact, my polymer is very much stretched, and I need to know that. What it means that in the future, right after this instant where I hit the target, the polymer statistically will collapse because I will be dragged by all the rest. So what it means is exactly the same. Either I know the conformation of all my degrees of freedom, or I encode this information in the future trajectories that will tell me that, yes, because you're correlated with extra degrees of freedom, you will snap back and have correlations that are encoded here. So you have exactly the same information. In that case, it's completely explicit. And you even understand why the Markov approximation overestimates now. Why does it get shorter when you have this non-Markovian effect? Because now you can take advantage of this fluctuation. You need a first passage time, so you will have events where your polymer is very much stretched, completely off the equilibrium configuration, and that will allow for much shorter times when you react. So that's what it means, in essence. To conclude, does it exist? So that's the very last two slides that I want to show you, and this comes from a purely artificial system. So that was done. So that was very much organized by Thomas Guérin. The experiment comes from Amit Kelly in Bordeaux. We wanted to know whether or not you have direct evidence experimentally of this effect. And the way to do that is to go in a well-controlled system. So you put beads in a polymer solution, so that can be done routinely. And the point is that now, by tuning the concentration of polymer in your solution, you can tune the dynamics of the bead. So that's typically the bead. You can track the bead. And what you can do is typically tune the polymer concentration. You go from water, where you have the historical Brownian motion. It's perfectly linear. You add polymer, you add polymer, you add polymer, and you deviate from the linear scaling. It's not something super fancy in terms of power law, but you have something that clearly has a few extra time scale with a crossover to the linear scaling. So again, I'm not after a model to explain this plot. I'm just showing that by tuning the concentration of polymer, you can go from purely Brownian Markovian diffusion to a more fancy correlation that will be induced by the interaction with polymers. And you can check that the process remains perfectly Gaussian. So now let's do reactions. And here the idea was not to look at first passage time, but a quantity which is very directly related, is in fact looking at reaction with two targets. And the point when you do experiments is that you can do even virtual reactions. So you will assume, so you take one coordinate of the bead, let's say x, your particle is here. you measure its x coordinate, and you just say that for some reason I have a target at x1, and I have another target at x2. This can be virtual. What I want to know here in this context is, will I hit first 1 or 2? Of course, you do not need to react because you can just put in your computer, I want x2 to be reached or x1 to be reached. I do not need to have a real chemical reaction. But you can still play that game experimentally. You measure trajectories, and you measure the probability, if you know where you start from, will I hit first 1 or will I hit first 2? Okay? Very simple. So you can do that. So first I need to extend Thomas' theory to do that, to 2 targets. So don't even look at that because it's late. But you can do it. So you can very much reproduce what we did for first passage time to these so-called splitting probabilities. Again, what you need to know to take into account the correlation, what you need to know is what will happen after you hit the target. But now you have 2 targets, so you have 2 mean future trajectories. So mu1 will be what happens if I know that I first hit 1, what will happen later on. I will again go back a little bit. Same for 2, but now it's asymmetric, so you have 2 unknown functions. The same machinery can be extended, and you can get a prediction for mu1, mu2, which means that eventually you get exactly a prediction for this probability P1 and this probability P2. You check that it works, and something which is interesting is that for this quantity, so the probability to first hit the target 2 as a function of where you start from, this quantity, in fact, you have a very clear signature of being Markov or non-Markov. And why is that? Is that because you have a very robust result. If you're Brownian, if you have no memory effect, it should be a linear scaling, very simple one. And as long as you're not linear, if you depart from this line, you're non-Markov. So that's the prediction. It works very well. And you can make the experiments. In water, you measure the splitting probability. It's perfectly the line that you expect. You can even measure in experiments trajectories in the future of a first passage event. They are perfectly symmetric. There is no bias. So this is strictly 0. This is strictly 0, I mean, around the position of your second target. Now you do that when you have a bunch of polymers. Your mean square displacement was clearly not linear, which means that you have memory effect. And what you find is that you have a very good argument, prediction and experiments, and you have a very clear departure from the linear scaling, which means that the memory effect will have quantitatively an impact on the reaction kinetics in this setup. And again, I know that this future trajectory is a bit abstract. Here you can measure it. So you measure the trajectory of the bit, you condition on the fact that you hit x1 first, you measure on average what will be the trajectory in the future, and this is now very much biased. You snap back and you make this quantitative. It is there, and that's in fact what encodes all the memory effect in your system. So that takes me to my conclusion slide. Coming back to my initial question, altogether, the take-home message, if you're interested in the dependence of this search time on the geometry, so mostly the volume that confine the process and the source to target distance, I discussed Markov, non-Markov, I discussed anomalous versus normal. What matters most is compact or non-compact. That's what would qualitatively completely change the game. And in fact, I've not shown it explicitly, but when you're non-Markov, this generic scaling that we had at the time only for Markov is still valid. What changes is prefactors, so that can go completely off under the Markov assumption, but in principle, you change only prefactors. So all this discussion is still true even when you have a memory effect at stake. So this is very, very general, and the take-home message is that when you're non-compact in that case, you're very good at large distances, and in fact, that's the best you could hope for. The interest of being compact means that you can get at very short distance something which is very efficient because you have some oversampling of space that ensures you that you will have direct trajectories that will not miss. And in the context of cells, all that is regulated by crowding itself. I know it's vague, and by biochemical affinity, because you can very much switch from completely non-compact free diffusion-like behavior to something which is much more restricted because of binding. And I will stop here by thanking you for your attention and my collaborators over the years. Thank you.